Today's Tim Keller sermon series is taken out of 1 Corinthians 6, and it addresses the controversial topic of sexuality. And Tim discussed this in the midst of a longer sermon series he titled Hot Potatoes, where he takes on these topics and tries to apply some biblical, scriptural context to help us interpret those issues. This sermon was given in 1997, and though it may appear a little bit dated now, I think that the truth that he provides at that time is still as relevant today. He begins by discussing the context of the Corinthian church. And the city of Corinth, he goes on to explain, the nation of Greece had wiped out and completely decimated it. And then the Romans had come back in later and then just completely rebuilt it very quickly. And it was a very pagan place, and it was a very sexually fluid place. And so if you think of any kind of major metro area today across the globe or even in America, I think you'll see a lot of the same values at that time in the city of Corinth are values that we'd find in those areas today. But this was so interesting because of the fact that at that time with their pagan worship, the Romans worshiped the god Aphrodite, and they actually had a temple for her, Tim explains. And he said at that temple, there were thousands of prostitutes who would descend on a nightly basis to perform kind of sexual acts out in the community. Can imagine what that would look like, don't want to imagine what that looks like, but that just kind of gives you a picture of what was going on back then. And what the Corinthian church was trying to overcome, now they had this new faith and were trying to understand how do we live in accordance with Christ and his objective for us, and try to piece all of this together. So Christians had to learn that with sex there's boundaries. And the way that they kind of reversed the psychology of how the pagans thought about it is they said, hey, sex has limitations, it's got boundaries, but money is easy to kind of give away and not something that we value. Where the pagans would say, hey, we're free-flowing, in terms of our sexuality, but money is something that we really prize and hold on to. So there was kind of a reverse dichotomy there. So there's two systematic problems that Paul tried to address in this letter that Tim also talks to in this sermon in terms of how Christians think about sex. And the first problem is it's just completely bad. It's an immoral thing, it's an evil thing, and we just need to avoid it and kind of shun it and purge ourselves of those impulses and just try to not deal with it at all. That's issue number one, and that's wrong thinking. And then the second piece is to treat sex as something that's just permissible, that you can do whenever you want, however you want, doesn't really matter. There's no guardrails, there's no boundaries. You can just kind of go with whatever feels right. And so both of those are going to be wrong ways of kind of viewing this good thing that God created. This is the point in time where Tim kind of goes back a little deeper and tells us, well, what is the purpose for sexual activity? Why did God create this? What is the benefit of it? What's the value of it? And how should we look at it today? So Tim kind of frames this up by saying that there's two embankments for kind of keeping safe rails on how you kind of frame up this topic. Embankment number one is commitment, and then embankment number two is complement. So first he talks about the commitment piece, and he discusses what it means to be human, that you're one in soul, spirit, and body, and that you can't disconnect those pieces and be whole and be fulfilled and be right with God. So if you disconnect the body and just view sex as something that's physical in nature, but you keep your heart and your soul and those aspects of you separate, he says you're committing some kind of a monstrous act where you're fragmenting your nature. And that when you do that, you're absolutely violating the way that God created you to be. So that would be the wrong approach for sure, to think about sex that way. And really the intent behind it is to be able to give your whole self to somebody, and you cannot look at your body as something that's just a physical material thing, but something that God created for you for eternity. And so you can't abuse it or treat it differently than the way you would basically view your spiritual aspects of yourself. And so you've got to keep it holy, you've got to keep it pure, and you've got to keep everything framed up in terms of commitment, and that you should commit to someone in marriage before you commit any kind of sexual activity. And so when you think about it that way, you're looking at sex with the highest view possible, that it's a complete commitment, that it's a complete ownership or selfless act where you're giving every aspect of yourself to somebody else, and that's the way that it's intended to be used. And that it's a way to have deep oneness, that's really the intent behind what it should look like. And then Tim goes on to explain that God created sex to be a foretaste of what union with him would be like. And so there's a complementarianism aspect of it, to where when you look at the way that a woman and a man are created and built, that there's an interlocking capacity there. And that's the framework that God wanted to paint a picture of in terms of our joy and ecstasy that we will have with him in eternity. And so to kind of violate that created capacity and to dip into other realms of sexual impulse or activity, whether it be homosexuality or other forms that veer away from this interlocking concept, that you would be deviating from God's intended purpose. And so that would be violating embankment number 2 that Tim talks about. Now, another question that sometimes gets brought up in regards to this topic is, why didn't Jesus get married if God wanted to show an illustration of how this can work the right way? Why didn't Jesus get married to someone in his earthly life? And the reason is because Jesus is engaged to the church. And so the complementary aspect is Jesus and the church in union, one with each other in perfect love, and that is the way that the marriage relationship paints a picture of the true relationship we're going to have with Jesus and community with him in eternity. So that's why Jesus didn't get married in his earthly life. Now, the last point that Tim addresses here in this sermon is he talks about just how sensitive of a topic this is for people. And he wants to remind all of us that this is not a central issue in the Bible. In fact, as it relates to homosexuality, there's only 11 verses that really talk about the subject at all. And there's a few reasons for that. Keller explains, one being that in the early church, it was kind of a given, that it was known that that was already kind of a violation and not a way that God intended sex to be used. But the other piece of it is, you look at what the Bible does address. Every picture, every example of what the holy framework looks like is in a heterosexual manner. So the Bible focuses more on the positive emphasis, or what the perfect picture does look like, instead of talking about the negative side or the downside or what it shouldn't look like. And then the other element of that too is the fact that the Bible spends a lot of time talking about more egregious sins like pride, greed, and materialism. And Tim says there's probably 50 times more content on those topics than there is on this topic. And so sometimes the church gets their priorities shift, kind of wrong when they isolate people or shun people for improprietary actions sexually, when they should really be focusing on these other issues that are much more damaging and much more central. And then finally, we have to remember the most central, critical item of the Bible is understanding Jesus and who he is, and that he's central to everything, and that we all have to unite around him and salvation and what he did for our sins, to come and die on the cross and to be raised again to save us from all categories of sin. So if this is one that you really struggle with and you're not sure kind of how to move forward and what the Bible's really speaking to on it, it's important to kind of remember to keep first things first and then deal with this one as a secondary element. Even though it is important and that the Bible does have a lot to say about it, let's make sure that we're keeping things in context and in the right priority. This was a bit of a short one today, but it was a sermon I did want to gloss over. It is one I wanted to share with you, and I'll continue to produce more Tim Keller sermon summaries on a regular basis. Please like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment if you want to continue to dialogue on this topic. Thank you so much, and I'll see you again soon.